Who Killed Ellie Bright? Written by S. Thomas Thompson. Narrated by Christian Neal. Chapter 1. What's that? Another package for someone else. With your name again? Yep, not sure why they have this address though, Marcus mused. He had been getting packages for another Marcus Bright for weeks on end now, pretty much one every other day. The first few he left unopened, expecting someone from the delivery company to come back and reclaim it. He even chased them up a few times. But after weeks and now a pile of around 20 packages, he started opening some to see what was inside. Whoever this other Marcus Bright is, they sure like some strange stuff, he thought to himself. This latest package was for a pair of slippers with a light in the front, activated by pressure. The marketing bump that went with it explained that it helped you visit the bathroom in the night without having to put the lights on and waking up the rest of the house. Marcus sighed at the inventiveness and/or stupidity of the new products brought out at that time of year. Christmas was coming. The sheer number of gifts that ended up in landfill gave Marcus a headache when he considered it. He put so much time and effort into picking the perfect gift for each and every person in his life. Even his Aunt Gladys, who everyone else found impossible to buy for. He listened all year round, picking up little hints from what was being said, and something stuck inside his head, only to return to the front of his brain at Christmas. He used this to find the ideal gift for all. His wife Ellie walked down the stairs and looked at the items in Marcus's hands. A pair of slippers. Not any pair of slippers. Watch. He pushed his hands inside the slippers and then pressed the soles against each other. See? He exclaimed, with a mix of glee and incredulity as the slippers lit up. She laughed, stood there shivering in her nightdress, which didn't get to within 6 inches of her knees. What will they think of next? Not sure I want to know, he returned, looking at his car out of the window of the porch. It had been another frosty night, as it tended to be in the northeast of England at that time of year. Temperatures of below zero had been predicted for every night of the week. For Marcus, that meant scraping the ice off his windscreen every morning of the week to head out for work. And it was only Tuesday. I'll have to get ready. Time's ticking, he said to Ellie, passing her on the last step of the stairs, where she'd been frozen with confusion at seeing the headlight slippers. He grabbed a suit out of the wardrobe, pulling a coat hanger with a shirt and tie already placed together. Ellie didn't like the colours that he chose to go together, so had taken it upon herself around a year earlier to match the shirt and tie on his behalf. Ellie told him that he was colourblind. It wasn't that. He just didn't have an eye for shades in the same way she did. He'd already been in the bathroom. With one bathroom for a house of 4 people, Marcus liked to get in there first. That way, he wasn't outside shouting, "How long are you gonna be?" while his teenage son or daughter was lost in a rabbit hole in the bathroom. Marcus didn't remember ever taking that long to get ready when he was a teenager, but then again, he was never a teenage girl. It took a matter of seconds to get the shirt, tie, and suit on. He grabbed his FM World fragrance out of the wardrobe, number 472. He had a selection of around 20 of these, all sold to him by his sister, who was a rep for the company. But 472 was his favourite, spraying it whenever he needed a lift or had an important day at work. And this was an important day. Marcus had an interview for a promotion, one that he had sought for the last 3 years. He had missed out once, the vacancy coming up 6 months earlier. The person they chose was from outside the company, but never seemed to fit in. Their values weren't anywhere near the same as the financial services company Marcus had been with since he left school. And they didn't last long at all, 4 months to be precise. As they were about to be pushed, they jumped. A tip-off from someone higher up, someone who had recommended them to the company in the first place. That was followed by a month where the company mulled over discarding with the position of senior planner. In the past, the role was mainly honorary, without much in the way of extra responsibility. But it was a reward for the hardest working and most successful advisor in the firm. And those two things always went hand in hand. The one who worked the hardest was the one with the results. And so, the company decided to reopen the vacancy, this time giving it more substance. If successful, Marcus was expected to lead training exercises designed to increase the sales of all in the team, in addition to being the standard bearer for the company. He would represent them at industry events, meaning nights away from home. Maybe he could use the headlight slippers when he stayed at hotels, he wondered. Marcus always struggled to sleep when not at home in his own bed. Putting the light on made this even worse. It took his eyes an age to stop being stimulated after seeing bright light at night. He headed off in his car, shouting goodbye to everyone and no one at the same time. Muffled replies came from the kids' bedrooms. Ellie made her way to the front door to see him off. "Good luck today, my handsome man." "Thank you, but I hope it's not down to luck. I've never really had much of that in my life." "You'll be more than fine. You have the stats on your side. And there's your background in training. I can't see how they could possibly choose anyone else." "Thanks, I needed that," Marcus replied, as he kissed his wife and then walked away to the car. As he reached the end of the drive, a UPS van pulled up. "Parcel for Marcus Bright, is that you?" "Can you leave it with my wife there? I'll deal with it when I get home," Marcus said, looking over his shoulder at the front door, which was still open. "Another one?" Ellie spoke as the UPS man put the parcel on the floor by her feet, looking at her long, exposed legs as he stood back up again. Ellie blushed at the attention, forgetting that she was stood there with one thin layer of clothing on, nothing from the thighs down. "Your husband asked me to give this to you," the UPS man explained, as he reciprocated her blushes, seeing that he had been caught looking. "Can you sign here?" "Sure thing," Ellie responded, hoping to get this over and done with quickly, so she could hide her embarrassment behind the safety of a closed front door. She watched Marcus finish clearing the ice from the car and waved as he pulled out of the street. The UPS man was sat in his van watching the scene, partly because he was entranced with Ellie's figure, but mainly because he couldn't leave the cul-de-sac until Marcus had pulled his BMW 3 Series out of the way. Ellie watched the van pull away before closing the door, wondering why the man had paid so much attention to her. She didn't consider herself to be naturally beautiful. The stares she drew from this man were something she had only really experienced before from Marcus and maybe one of her previous boyfriends. Most men looked straight through her, even when she wore as little as she did that morning. The van pulled away and the unease pulled away with it. Ellie closed the door, dropping to the floor in a fetal position as she did. The radiator in the hallway felt like it was giving her a warm hug, protecting Ellie from the feeling that she had when dealing with the delivery driver. Marcus looked in the rear-view mirror of his car as he drove to work. The UPS driver must have the same route as me, he thought to himself. Every time he turned a corner, the delivery driver that had dropped another parcel to his door took the same turn. Marcus listened to a CD in his car, the aerial on the roof of his car damaged by an over-vigorous car wash and rendering the radio useless. The car was booked in for a service next week. He'd asked them to look at the aerial at the same time. As Marcus turned the last corner but one to his place of work, he noticed the UPS van was no longer showing in his mirror. He parked up and got out. It was a day of reckoning. Chapter 2. Augustine Boyle stretched as far as his limbs could go. It was rare that he woke up and he was the only one in bed. His partner Christine must have gone to see their daughter, Nightingale. The star shape he made in the bed reminded Augustine of the star jumps he had to do over and over again at school. They were obsessed with making kids fitter and stronger. The PE teachers used to stand over a group of children delivering their own brand of motivation. But he wasn't that type of kid. Augustine didn't try harder when he was shouted at. In fact, quite the opposite. He got up and walked to the mirror on the wall at the opposite side of the bedroom. He had taken a punch tackling a killer the week before, and the right-hand side of his face had swelled. Augustine had taken them for right-handed. Trust him to come across as southpaw. He tried to duck and ended up just ducking into the uppercut. It still felt as raw as it did the day it happened to Augustine, but all the checks, MRIs and X-rays came up with no lasting damage. All he could do was wait for the swelling to die down. After spending a few months in a coma after a devastating blow from another killer, any blow to the head worried Augustine and everyone around him. Not long after that, the number of people around him grew. Christine moved in. Nightingale followed. His life was so very different before and after that. The coma felt as though it shielded a life that Augustine knew he had lived, but wasn't totally sure what it was like. His memory wouldn't give up all the details, no matter how hard he tried. He looked out of the window. Another rainy day. There were far too many of these in the northeast of England, as far as he was concerned. He had always told people that he would move one day, but all of his roots were here in Washington. He was born there, went to school there, worked there, and now had a family there. The window of opportunity to move somewhere warmer and drier closed more all the time. Augustine was no longer sure he would fit through that window. As he got ready for work, he could hear the laughter between mother and daughter in the next room. He loved to hear this sound. As his baby girl had grown up to something close to no longer being a baby, her character shone through. He could tell she was going to be one of those happy children who saw fun and sunshine in everything. Augustine tiptoed past her room, not wanting to interrupt the joy. He would listen to it from downstairs, leaving the door open so he could eat his breakfast, listening to the women in his life having a whale of a time. "Augustine, is that you?" Christine asked as the floorboard creaked under his heavy-footed gait. He forgot in his haste to get past and leave them to it that there was a floorboard that needed his attention. I thought I'd grab some breakfast." "And not come in to say good morning?" "You sounded like you were having so much fun. I didn't want to interrupt." "Well, as always, your timing is immaculate. I need the loo, and she needs a nappy changed. Get yourself in here," Christine instructed. As she did, she walked over and gave him a hug and a kiss on the cheek. He reciprocated. Seconds later, he was dealing with a stinky nappy. But he wouldn't have changed that smell for the world. In fact, it was the person who was his world that delivered that smell to his nostrils. Augustine had become adept at changing a nappy. The first few times he ended up with poo everywhere, and both him and baby needed a wash afterwards. He was all fingers and thumbs, but watching Christine and practicing left him in the position where he could change a nappy wearing his suit and be confident that it wouldn't need a trip to the dry cleaners after. As he finished, the phone in the inside pocket of his suit buzzed. Christine re-entered the room, picked the phone out for him, and pressed it against the side of his face. "Augustine speaking." "Gus, don't come to the station. Head straight over to Finchdale in Biddick. We've got a body. Woman in her 40s. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, Augustine replied, before indicating to Christine to take the phone away. He washed his hands, kissed his partner and daughter on the cheek, and headed out of the house. Chapter 3. Marcus was sat outside the interview room, twiddling his thumbs back and forth. The nervous energy was far too much for him to bear. He wanted to jump up and down on the spot 50 times. That would rid him of the extra energy that was coursing its way through his body. Marcus wanted it all over. An hour later, he was back outside of the same interview room, sitting in the same seat. They had finished with him, but he wasn't anywhere near ready to return to his desk. There were no clients that day. Marcus had managed his workload, so he was only doing admin tasks. Marcus went out for around an hour earlier that morning. He told his secretary it was to blow off the cobwebs. He came back looking flustered, but his secretary couldn't remember the last time he'd looked anything other than flustered. He knew that he wouldn't be able to concentrate on a client before the interview, and after, he was going to crash, like he always did an hour after drinking a bottle of Lucozade. That day, he had both the crash from the energy drink he had had before the interview and the nervous energy robbing him of vital calories. The crash was going to last long into the evening. As he gathered himself, Marcus looked at the large clock on the wall. It was almost midday. He decided that an early lunch was going to help him calm down and replenish the missing calories. As he walked to the front door, the street and the food options nearby, he called his wife. Ellie seemed more excited than he was about the interview and the potential promotion. He'd better tell her how he'd done, or she'd be on his case all afternoon. The phone rang to answer phone. Not like Ellie at all. In all the years they'd been together, she had never missed a call. Working from home and mainly on her phone meant she was always available. Not this time. Marcus walked past reception towards the car park, deciding whether to walk the 5 minutes down the road or be lazy and jump in the car. As he mulled over the options, the car seemed more and more appealing. He wasn't always lazy, but certainly had some lazy days, that was for sure. He concentrated his eyes on his car, thinking that if he broke his gaze, he would change his mind and regret it. The last time he did that, the heavens opened, and he got drenched. He was concentrating on the number plate, which read NA83MLB, the last 3 letters mirroring his initials, Marcus Lee Bright. He told friends at school that it was Marcus Le Bright, coming from French origin. He didn't know if any of them believed him. He didn't care. Deep in thought, Marcus was already imagining the Zinger burger sat in his hand as he raised it to his mouth. "Marcus!" Jenny, the receptionist, shouted across the room, breaking him from his mouth-watering daydream. "Hi, Jenny. What can I do you for?" he responded in typical jokey fashion. He laughed. She didn't. "Just had this delivered for you." "For me?" Marcus exclaimed as he looked the package up and down. It was around the size of a book. He wondered what the other Marcus Bright had ordered now. "Yeah, for you," Jenny replied impatiently. "By that guy there." Marcus turned around to see the UPS van drive off and caught a glimpse of the driver. The same one that had delivered to his home earlier that morning. The one he thought had followed him to work. "What's that on your collar?" Jenny asked, pointing to the browny-red stain that sat on the left collar, showing at the front of his shirt. "Oh, that. I had a Greg's bacon sandwich this morning. Couldn't make my mind up between ketchup and brown sauce." "And?" "Well, I chose both. Must have squirted out of the sandwich," he explained. "Up there, on your collar?" she asked. Marcus ignored her. He didn't want the conversation to go on any longer. The silence lasted 10 seconds, without eye contact. "Thanks, Jenny," he said absently, as he looked the package up and down before leaving the building and walking to the car. His mind was on food and nothing else. Marcus decided not to open it and take it home to add to the collection. He'd had all he could take of items like headlight slippers for one day. Maybe he and Ellie would open all of the boxes at once and have a good laugh at them when he was in a more relaxed mood. He set off in the direction of KFC, placing the box on the passenger seat of his car. Marcus had his mind set on filling his belly while reading the newspaper. He stopped at the newsagent's before going on to the drive-thru. He would fill his head with the news while filling his mouth with chicken coated in a secret blend of herbs and spices. Chapter 4. Augustine and Electra met at the scene. She had waited for him, bowing to his seniority, even though she knew he didn't need such deference. "Augustine, the neighbour saw the door slightly open and said that was really unusual. When she pushed it and called out, she saw a pair of legs sticking out from behind the kitchen door. Further inspection showing up a lot of blood. The neighbour ran and called the police. We're the first on the scene," she explained, gathering all of that information between the phone call and the few minutes she'd been there before her boss. "Thanks, Electra. Anything else?" he asked. "Not at the moment." "Then, shall we go through?" he asked, nodding his head in the direction of the property. A police officer was setting out "Police Do Not Cross" tape behind them. The sirens of an ambulance could be heard in the background, not that one was needed from what they had been told. The scene was exactly as the neighbour had described when she called the police. There was blood down the kitchen worktops and working its way across a laminate wooden floor, gathering in a pool around the body like it was a protective force field that no longer functioned. The life force had already left the body. "There's not much point in that ambulance racing its way here," Augustine said as he looked at the body. She was still in her nightdress, face down with her long legs exposed. He wanted to cover her up. She deserved that. But they had work to do. Electra looked up and down the kitchen worktops for anything that would give up more information on what had happened. In the kitchen sink was all the information she needed. A bloody knife. "Gus, look at this," she said, breaking his stare from the prostrate body. "Oh, shit," he replied, looking at the blade. "How long is that? 7 inches? 8? More?" "I'd say about 8 inches. No wonder there's so much blood." Electra looked at the bloody handprints that ran along the counter from where the knife lay in the kitchen sink, along to directly above where the woman lay. She imagined the struggle for life, grabbing on with all her might before finally letting go. "And what's this?" Augustine asked, stooping down along the left-hand side of the body. He got as close as he could, balancing his weight expertly on his haunches so he didn't topple. Placing a glove on his hand, he followed a track of bruises along her arm to her hand. "Oh, a missing finger," he continued, holding his ungloved hand over his mouth to stop him from gagging. "And the ring finger, if I'm not mistaken," Electra stated, trying to get a vantage point around the side of Augustine's frame. She wasn't close enough, nor had a view uninterrupted enough to confirm for sure. "Yes, it is," Augustine responded, checking the cut. "Ouch!" Electra exclaimed. "Delivered by that knife, I'd say. Serrated edges, something like a bread knife," he asked, looking at the state of the finger. It had been sawn rather than cut, making the soft flesh around the edge of the cut fray away like fabric on a worn hem that hadn't been reattached. "Yes, that's a bread knife," Electra replied. She could tell that her words fell on deaf ears. Augustine was deep in thought. She joined him, wondering what had happened there. Even though it was her job to find out, sometimes the situation froze her. The two of them were disturbed by a voice coming from the front door. "Hello!" Augustine looked at Electra, wondering why someone had made their way through the police cordon. "I'll go," she stated, leaving him to his thoughts. As she turned the corner of the kitchen, Electra saw 2 paramedics peering around the front door, as though they were children looking for permission to enter. "You can come through. Not sure there's a lot you can do, but the body is in here," she explained, looking over her shoulder. She spoke loudly so Augustine could hear. She didn't want him to be surprised by more people entering the room. He was clumsy enough to fall into the pool of blood if startled. The paramedics walked through the door and set about their work. One looked for a pulse that was never going to be there, while the other looked for the source of the blood. It was futile, maybe 1 in a million chance to save someone who had lost this much blood, but they were trained to give everyone the same attention regardless of their chances of survival. The wound to her side was covered with a bandage, and she was hoisted onto a stretcher with an oxygen mask over her mouth. Pretty soon, she had 2 lines in her arm, one replenishing the blood she had lost, the other giving her fluids. Her heart wasn't beating, so they shocked her. Nothing still. Her only chance, that 1 in a million, was to get her to hospital and see if they could manage a miracle. Augustine and Electra already knew she wasn't going to make it. They already knew they were dealing with a murder. Chapter 5. Marcus reached the KFC drive-thru on the Wessington Way in Sunderland. He worked in the Business Innovation Centre, known locally as the BIC, nearby. This was the closest place he could get his fix of fried chicken from that famous global brand. As he pulled up, he remembered that he couldn't get a drink he liked in KFC. They had done away with all the full-fat options, leaving him with a choice of diets, lights, and maxes. He didn't even like the Crush'ems, which was as close as they got to the milkshakes he liked in McDonald's. "Welcome to KFC. Can I take your order?" the voice coming from the ordering pillar asked. "A Zinger burger, a fillet burger, and a Pepsi," was what he wanted to say. He got the first 3 words out before the voice at the other end asked him another question. "Is that a meal?" No thanks, just the burger, he responded, before repeating his order. A Zinger burger, a fillet burger, and a Pepsi. He couldn't remember if regular Pepsi was still on their menu. It wouldn't have been his first choice, stepping away from caffeine a few years earlier, but it was far more preferable to any of the diet options. He couldn't abide the taste of diet drinks. Marcus felt that they tasted artificial, and he didn't like anything artificial in his life. Please drive to the next window, the voice replied. Marcus breathed a sigh of relief that Pepsi was still available. He paid, grabbed the bag of food, and drove off, looking for somewhere he could sit and see the River Wear while eating his food. Marcus lifted the UPS box from the seat to put his food down and noticed a stain on his seat. As he looked at the bottom of the box, he could see a red substance on the bottom, dripping onto the seat. He dropped the KFC bag onto his lap and moved the dripping box so it was over the floor mats rather than the seat, looking for a way to open it while keeping his fingers clean. Marcus saw a slight tear in the sellotape at the top corner and got his fingernail underneath it, pulling away at the tape. It moved after a few attempts, lifting to reveal a gap in the box, which he pushed at with his middle finger. As it drew open, Marcus recoiled at the contents, dropping it on the floor. He didn't recognize his wife's finger. Who would recognize the finger of a loved one when it was lifeless, detached from the rest of the hand? But he did recognize the wedding and engagement rings he had put on Ellie's finger almost 20 years earlier. His seat wasn't having a great day. A mouthful of vomit covered the blood that was already sticking to the fabric. Marcus knew he should have gone for leather. His head was spinning, not thinking straight. He gathered his thoughts and picked up his phone to dial 999. As he looked to the right, wondering if anyone had seen him puke, he spotted a UPS van driving slowly across to the right, back towards Washington and home. He started the ignition and set off in the same direction to see if it was the same van. A couple of right turns, and he was able to maneuver his car into the right lane next to the van at the next roundabout. It was the same man. Marcus set off in chase. The van driver was oblivious to his tail until Marcus started flashing his lights and sounding his horn. Marcus could see the man in the large wing mirror looking back. The exact second that he recognized Marcus saw him push the accelerator harder, plunging it to the floor. The van lurched off a few feet ahead of Marcus. He did the same thing, seeing his car easily catch the van up again. With this display of power, he expected the UPS van to pull over. It didn't. The driver saw that power wasn't going to win the day, so he used the bulk of the van to take up both lanes at the next roundabout, stopping Marcus from getting ahead. Marcus decided to bide his time. He could stay with the van all day, assuming that he had more gas in the tank. Having driven a pizza delivery van for a few months when he was in university, Marcus knew that these things guzzled the gas. He settled in to follow the van. Marcus was prepared to play the long game. At the next roundabout, crossing over the A19, Marcus and the UPS van were the only two at the lights. The van driver covered the two lanes heading straight across back to Washington. Marcus decided that it was too risky to sit in the other lane, so he sat behind the van. The lights turned green. The driver didn't move the van. More cars assembled behind Marcus and his prey. Horns were sounded. Lights flashed. Still, the UPS van didn't move. The lights turned red again. At this point, as traffic started to move from standing still to heading down the A19 at 70+ miles per hour, the UPS driver released the handbrake and moved his vehicle across the lanes of traffic. The danger was obvious. Marcus let him go. He had no other choice. By the time he made his way around the roundabout safely, the van was nowhere in sight. He picked up the phone again and dialed the number of a detective who Marcus had spoken to about the packages. He first thought it was something sinister, but was reassured that it was just a case of mistaken identity. Chapter 6. Hello, Detective Augustine Boyle speaking. It's Marcus Bright. We spoke a little while ago. I want you to look into something. Marcus, thanks for calling. We need to speak to you. Can you come to the police station as a matter of urgency, please? Augustine spoke clearly and calmly. He had been trained to speak this way to a potential suspect. "There's a UPS van that's just nearly ran me off the road, and several other people too. I think it needs to be investigated. He dropped a parcel off at my place of work. It had Ellie's finger in it." Marcus spat out the words, knowing he wouldn't get long to explain himself. "And we can talk about that when you come to the station." Augustine stayed on the same line. It was another lesson from a communications training workshop a few years ago that stuck in his mind. People respect consistency. "I can't get there right now. I'm busy," Marcus replied, looking to wiggle his way out of the conversation with excuses. It reminded him of the conversation he used to have with school teachers. You know, the kind of dog-ate-my-homework conversations. "Marcus, we don't have to want to come after you now, do we?" Another school teacher-school kid line. Marcus was concerned. He too had been given training on the way people communicate. His financial services employer saw this as the way to spot the difference between true objections and excuses. Some people didn't buy from the firm because they didn't understand. Others didn't buy because they had no intention of buying. It would save time and money knowing which was which, the employer decided. Marcus had been shown how to spot the signs face to face and over the phone too. He knew that he was being given a question that was designed to press him for either a true objection or another excuse. The objection could be worked upon. The excuse in this case would trigger action from the police to bring him in. Marcus hung up. He didn't have anything to counter with. His instinct told him to trust nobody, and his gut was usually right. He trusted that above all the training he had been given. In this case, his gut was telling him to steer clear of the detective. Chapter 7. Marcus sat at the Peel retail park eating his cold chicken burgers. He had already called the police. He was put through to a detective that was heading up the case into the murder of his Ellie. But something wasn't right about the conversation. A chat that should have been reassuring was nothing of the sort. There were no platitudes such as, "I'm sorry for your loss," more in the way of, "Who can vouch for your whereabouts this morning?" Marcus felt an unease. He guessed that apart from the killer, he and the kids were the last people to see Ellie alive. Maybe that's just the way detectives saw the world, Marcus told himself. But the unease was strong. Marcus decided that he had to do some detective work himself. Just walking into the police station felt like it was certain arrest. Who would look after the kids? Marcus picked up his phone, wiping off the grease that he had left there with his KFC hands, and searched the internet. The nearest UPS depot he could find was in Leeds, so he dialed and waited, and waited, and waited. Eventually, someone who sounded flushed answered. "UPS, Kevin speaking. How can I help?" "Kevin, I'm in the northeast. Where's your nearest depot to me?" "We've got one in Sunderland. You want the phone number?" "Yes, sorry. Yes, please." Marcus jotted the number down on a pad he always kept in the glove compartment of the car. He was given the pad as a Secret Santa present a few years back. It was a what to do in an emergency pad, showing all the questions he needed to ask and all the information he needed to gather in case of bumping into another car. The pen hadn't been used in the intervening period, so the ink was sketchy. He scratched the number into the paper, some ink taking, other sections having an indent that told the number instead. Dialing the number quickly so he didn't lose track of markings on his paper, Marcus found that all UPS depots had the same speed of answering calls. Eventually, the phone at the other end had a voice. "UPS Sunderland, Marcy speaking. How can I help?" More consistency, Marcus thought. "Hi, Marcy. My name is Marcus. I'd like to ask a few questions about a driver you have, if that's okay." Marcy was known by her colleagues for loving gossip. Data protection should probably have stopped her from saying a word more, but that wasn't the way Marcy functioned. "Tell me more," she requested. "I was cut up by one of your drivers, a male around 6 foot tall, 15 stone plus, long beard and wearing jeans and a tracksuit top," Marcus explained. "Oh, doesn't sound like one of ours," Marcy replied. "The manager here, he's pretty strict on uniform. He wouldn't have got away with leaving the depot dressed like that." "Interesting. Does the manager there allow people to run red lights?" Marcus replied in anger. He wanted to scream and shout, but instinctively knew that Marcy wouldn't respond well to that at all. No, he wouldn't put up with that either. If our drivers get any kind of rebuke from their driving, then they land in hot water. That goes for everything from another driver complaining to points on their licence. If I can take some details, then I can start an investigation. Oh, what did you say your name was again? Marcy asked. Marcus wasn't willing to give any data in the opposite direction, just calling to get information for himself. Thinking on his feet, Marcus decided to cut to the chase, putting Marcy off from asking any more questions about his personal data. I have his registration number if that helps, he offered. Oh yes, that helps greatly, she replied, seeming to forget that she had just asked for his name. It's November, Uniform, 6, 6, Alpha, Papa, Bravo, Marcus said, hearing Marcy's voice at the other end of the line repeating every word he said. Marcus was never sure about the phonetic alphabet. Was it Bravo or was it Beta? Was Papa the right word for the letter P, or should it have been Peter? He never knew if he was right or not, but the message got through. Are you sure about that number? Let me repeat it, Marcus said. November, Uniform, 6, 6, Alpha, Papa, Bravo. Yes, that's what I've searched. There must be a mistake. Could one of the 6s have been a 5? Or maybe it was Alpha, Papa, Papa, or even Alpha, Bravo, Bravo. What do you say? No, that's definitely the right registration number. I have the image etched in my brain. I followed the guy for some time. Why do you ask? That's not one of ours, Marcy explained. She was going to ask for his name and address, plus contact details again. Before another word could come out of her mouth, the caller had hung up. Chapter 8. Marcus had no idea what to do next. The police were looking for him, and the voice of the detective had told him that he was their prime suspect. He knew the police, or at least he thought he knew. A friend from school joined the police after he was made redundant from a bank. They went out for a drink every now and again. While most of their friends had broken off their friendship when he enlisted in the police, the only friends people in the police had was others in the police and all that. Marcus had stayed in touch, and there was one conversation from one particular night that stuck in his mind. The friend said that the police were so overstretched in terms of resources that when they had a suspect in the frame, they stopped looking for alternatives. If they spent a week on a case, then they would have another 20+ cases land on their desk in the meantime. Their policy was that if someone looked guilty, then they probably were. Marcus listened at the time over a few pints and wondered at how he had ended up in this situation. At the time, it was something to laugh in astonishment at. Now, it was at the very core of his thinking. The detective had pretty much pointed the finger at him, and now he was worried that they wouldn't even bother looking elsewhere. So, that narrowed his options. He was sure that he couldn't go home, even though he desperately wanted to see his children and make sure they were coping with the tragedy. Likewise, he couldn't contact any members of Ellie's family. She had a large family that all looked out for each other. His wife was different. He didn't have what you would conventionally call a family. Given up for adoption at birth, Marcus didn't know anything about his biological parents until he was 16. That was how old he was when he put the pieces together. By the time he found out who they were, his biological mother and father were dead. A year later, the people who he called Mum and Dad were gone too. No siblings, no aunts or uncles. Marcus was alone until he found Ellie. Her family was warm and welcoming, but they wouldn't be now if the police had been to see them and sown the seeds of doubt in their mind. The family wouldn't help him if they believed that he was Ellie's killer. That route was out. Marcus was sure that friends would be tracked. His workplace would be swarming with police. He had to go it alone. And then it struck him right between the eyes. Marcus knew the place he had to go in order to clear his name and find out who the killer was. It was risky, but the risk was worth it. I'll clear my name and find whoever killed you, Ellie, Marcus said as he kissed his wedding ring and he set off. Chapter 9. We have scoured the place. The only DNA and fingerprints we have here are from the people who live here. By the look of things, the kitchen is the place in the house where they spend most of their time. It's covered in clues as to who has spent time here. And it's the four of them, Mr. and Mrs. Bright and the kids. I can't find anything significant from any other source, the lead forensic explained to Electra. It was the news she had expected. Thanks. Anything else we need to know? She asked out of professional courtesy. It wasn't as though he would have left out something vitally important to the investigation. That's pretty much it, apart from the fact that the handle of the knife has only been touched by one pair of hands since it was last washed. And those hands belong to Marcus Bright. Chapter 10. Boyle, why are we going? Gary asked. Electra was detailing the rest of the team on the developments of the day and putting out a call to the ANPR operators for Marcus Bright's car. Because we follow up every lead, Augustine replied, looking at Gary's position in the passenger seat of his car. Gary had pushed the seat back as far as it went. It looked like he was in the back seat. Augustine was reminded of a teenager who didn't want to be seen with their parent. He hoped that his daughter, Nightingale, would never be embarrassed to be seen with him at any stage of her life.
Ugh, but we know who it was. Can't we move on? Gary inquired,
hoping that he could get back to his phone rather than the conversation that he'd started. We never move on until we pass things over to the CPS, happy and safe in the knowledge that we've put together a watertight case. You know the way I operate, Augustine explained. Gary never liked the way that Augustine operated. It rankled with him that he was working under someone whose methods he had no respect for. Gary looked down at his phone, hoping that something would come up on his Facebook timeline that would keep his interest for the next 15 minutes, which is how long he had estimated the drive to the UPS depot would take. He had only recently joined Facebook, only recently got a smartphone, only recently been interested in the online world. It was his new partner, Agnes. She had changed him in many ways, but his disagreeable work self wasn't one of them. Augustine enjoyed the silence that Gary's attention to his phone brought. It allowed him to stay with his thoughts, working through the evidence they had gathered so far. And all of that evidence was pointing in the direction of Marcus Bright. The DNA, the fingerprints, the murder weapon, and the fact that Marcus refused to come to the station. But the one thing they were missing at that point in time was the motive. Marcus didn't sound like a wife killer. There was no previous criminal record, no reports from work colleagues, friends, family, or anyone else for that matter, of him raising a hand to a living soul. That was why he and Gary were headed to the UPS office. Marcus broke cover to tell him about the van driver. It might lead somewhere. Gary's laughter from the passenger seat distracted Augustine from his train of thought. What's so funny, Gary? He asked, not knowing the man to laugh very often.
It's this Facebook group. Dashcam footage. It always makes me laugh, Gary replied, still chuckling at the last clip while the next one loaded.
Oh, this one's in Washington, Gary said, reading the headline before the clip was ready to watch. It always seemed to take an age when he didn't have access to Wi-Fi.
And it has a UPS van in it too. Now there's a coincidence.
Augustine pulled his car over around 20 yards in front, having first checked the mirrors. The road was strangely quiet. He was leaning over Gary's shoulder, trying to shift his chair back as far as it could go, so he could see. The video was the same scene that Marcus Bright had outlined in their brief conversation. A UPS van covered 2 lanes of the roundabout they were only a few minutes from, over the A19 in the opposite direction. The video was captured by the car behind the one Augustine now knew belonged to Marcus Bright. It matched the description and registration he had been given earlier. The van then waited until the lights had turned from green back to red before racing off across oncoming traffic. Horns sounded, tires screeched, and bad language was hurled out of the windows of vehicles. Then the UPS van was off and away. The clip stopped. Well, let's get to the UPS depot and try to clear this up, Augustine said, looking over his shoulder and indicating that he wished to rejoin the flow of traffic that had suddenly become much busier than when they were stopped. They were there in under the 15 minutes Gary had predicted. Both men seemed to jump out of the car, meaning business, and both were at the door of the office, knocking on the glass top half of the door. The receptionist looked up from her desk and buzzed them in. "Can I help?" she asked while the door was still open. Her voice was muffled by a lorry leaving the depot, revving their engine. "'Scuse me?" Gary asked. "Can I help?" the receptionist asked again, this time with the sound travelling from her mouth to their ears without distraction. "I hope so," Gary replied, flashing his badge. "Oh, can I help, officer?" she corrected herself. "Detective," Gary said, by way of second correction. "Can I help detectives?" she asked, looking at Augustine for some reason when she got none from the man who had spoken so far. Augustine flashed his badge too. "I'm Detective Boyle. This is Detective Hall. We'd like to ask a few questions about one of your drivers and one of your vans, if we may. Who's the best person to speak to?" "I'll try my best. I'm Marcy, by the way. It's funny, you know, we don't often get people asking about our vans or our drivers, but you're the second today, and you sound far more official than the last one." "Did the person come here?" Augustine asked, with an urgency in his voice. "No, it was on the phone. When I asked for his details, he hung up. I'd love to give you his name, detectives, but I don't have it." "Don't worry about that. We already have his name. But enough about him. Back to the van. Gary, show her the clip," Augustine instructed. Marcy leant over the reception desk and peered into Gary's phone. The clip was only a minute long, but it confirmed the tale the mystery caller had made earlier in the day. She looked at the registration. It was the same as the one she had been given over the phone by the mystery man. The note on her desk was still there with the number written on it. "This isn't our van. I've checked further. This doesn't belong to our company. You can tell from a few of the decals that it isn't us. The P on the logo doesn't have a long enough tail. It's kind of our thing. The P reaches down towards the bottom of the UPS shield. This looks like it has been printed by someone else and attached to a brown van. And that's the other thing. I can't vouch for the quality of the video, but the brown on here doesn't match our brown," Marcy said, pointing to the still image she'd paused on the screen as she explained. "So, what are you saying?" Augustine asked, making eye contact. "This is someone pretending to be UPS. It's not the real thing." "Fuck," Gary said under his breath. Chapter 11. Marcus made his way back to his home. The tears streamed down his face as he made the last few turns. This was his and Ellie's dream home, the place where they were going to grow old together. Ellie used to work for an estate agent. One of the questions she used to ask people was, "Is this the one?" And for them, this was the one. He stopped as he pulled into their street and looked left and right. The neighbours to the left were both professionals, and by the look of things were still out at work. If he pulled his car all the way forward onto his drive, then he could use the 20-foot hedge at the front of the garden to shield his vehicle from the rest of the street. Marcus had always hated that hedge, vowing to cut it down one weekend when he had the time. He never had the time. Now he was thankful for the busy life that took his weekends in directions other than cutting down hedges. It would give him the gift of time. He drove slowly, as though this careful driving would make him and his car invisible. Once pulled up as close as he could to the garage, he looked to the neighbour's house to the left, confirming his suspicion that they would still be at work. It was one of the reasons the dream house was a dream. The neighbours were quiet and predictable. It made life peaceful for Marcus, Ellie, and the kids. Getting out of the car and closing the door as quietly as he could, Marcus looked through the window to ensure that the police weren't still at the scene. At first, he felt that this was the place he needed to avoid the most, but thinking about it, he knew that the police would have taken Ellie's body, secured the property, and not let the kids go there. All of this meant that he could get in to make his search. The lock on the front door had been changed. The police had to secure the place. Marcus knew that. But what the police didn't know was that the mechanism on the window at the side of the property had been broken for a few months.
another outstanding chore that Marcus hadn't found the time for, another piece of fortune when he needed it most. Quickly through the window, Marcus walked along on his haunches, not wanting to be seen by anyone outside the confines of his home. He walked past the kitchen door and had to look. The blood still hadn't been cleared up, smelling foul as it congealed on the floor, the worktops, and the sink. Marcus sobbed as he huddled into a fetal position, looking at the exact spot on the floor where his beautiful wife had been slain. Marcus laid there for a full 20 minutes, crying into his forearms as he rocked slowly backwards and forwards, trying to soothe himself. The rocking slowed. Marcus regained his consciousness of the world outside of his body, and he looked towards the front door. The porch was glass from waist height upwards, so he would have to stay low in order to get what he wanted from there without being seen. Marcus crawled his way along before grabbing the door between the porch and the rest of the house. It marked the boundary where the house used to end. The previous occupants had it added to the home. To Marcus, it made total sense. Who wanted muddy shoes along the hallway? Keep them in the porch. He slid along the cold tiled floor, awakening his sense that had been dulled in his fetal ball. He grabbed at the boxes piled up in the corner of the porch and threw them one by one into the hallway behind him. Once the last parcel was behind him, Marcus slid back and closed the door between the main house and the porch. In the sanctuary of the hallway, he could sit on the stairs and open these parcels one by one without anyone from outside the home being able to see him. The first few were the same kind of rubbish that he'd opened first thing that morning. The first was a deck of playing cards, where all the royal family was replaced by Ozzy Osbourne and his family. Sharon was an especially ferocious queen. The next parcel was a kind of corkscrew device used to remove earwax. Marcus winced as he pictured that entering his ear. He laughed at the side of the packaging that stated dishwasher-proof, as if you'd be putting that in there with all the dishes. He kept opening parcels, leaving a pile of empty boxes behind him. As he opened the box, he piled up the receipts one by one onto a pile on the stairs next to him. There were only 3 left now. Marcus was going to choose the one in the middle, imagining himself ripping away at the cardboard with fingers that were now growing tired at the constant tearing apart of glued cardboard. He stretched his frame, pondering if he would find what he was looking for. As he did, a car drove past. Marcus dropped to the floor. He wondered if the neighbours were home. Chapter 12. "We have a description," Augustine said to Marcy, growing weary at the time it took to get information. If only they had Marcus Bright in custody, they could interview him and hopefully tie all of this up. "I'm all ears," Marcy said, seeming just as weary at events. "Let me guess, male around 6 foot tall, 15 stone plus, long beard and wearing jeans and a tracksuit top." "How did you know?" Gary asked. "Don't forget, this isn't the first time today I've been asked about this driver," she replied. "Oh yeah," Gary said, as he realized the situation. "And does this match anyone who works here?" Augustine asked. "No, it doesn't." "Oh," Augustine sighed. "But I've been thinking about it since the last phone call. It does match the description of someone who used to work here. Everything except the beard, that is. Let me look at that video again," Marcy instructed, as she looked deep in thought. As she watched the video, the realization grew on her face. Augustine and Gary watched Marcy rather than watching the video. She moved her head back, pushing her frame into the comfort of the chair behind her. "It's a recently sacked driver," she said. "His name?" Gary asked. "Marcus Bright." Chapter 13. "ANPR on the phone," Alice said to Electra. "Can you take it?" Electra asked, her head deep in whatever was on the computer screen on her desk. "Sure," Alice responded, picking up a pen and her desk notepad. Electra was looking at the reports from the forensics team. There really was nothing but Bright DNA in the home.
It was a wonder how clean Ellie Bright had kept the home, and when the last visitors were there. Speaking to the neighbours told a tale of a family that just did their own thing. None of the neighbours were ever invited over for a coffee, a chat, or a barbecue. The links between the Bright family and the rest of the neighbourhood were simply down to geography. They were only connected because they lived in the same place. Electra was sad that this had become the way people lived in the modern age. When she was young, people had strong ties, connecting to each other in deeper and more meaningful ways. People lived next door to each other for decades, forming bonds that were passed down through generations. She still stayed in touch with the people her parents lived next door to when she was a child, meeting up with them every now and again for a coffee. But she was sure she was in a tiny minority. Electra looked at the finer details in the report, the things that most in the team would ignore. This was the part where they listed the smallest amounts of DNA, the insignificant ones as far as detective work was concerned. Every strand of DNA that was captured was included in the report. But these tiny fragments of DNA that were listed at the bottom of the report could have been from post being dropped through the door by the postman or brought in off the school uniform from the kids. They were present, but not in enough quantity to put someone at the scene of the crime. But she wanted a full picture. Electra always wanted a full picture. Some were on the government DNA database, others were not. Electra looked at the names, picturing a face to go with each. "Electra," Alice said, now stood by the edge of Electra's desk. "Yeah," she replied, absent-mindedly, still capturing a presumed image of the person whose name she'd just read. "They've spotted Marcus Bright's car." "Where?" "You'll never believe it." "Where?" "He's gone home." Chapter 14. Marcus was laid as flat as he could get on the floor of the place that he, Ellie and the kids used to call home. It was a good job he was wearing a brown suit, he told himself, as it matched the wooden floor. Ellie had chosen the floor, saying it had class and would stay classy for a very long time. The way she described it made him worry less about the extra expense of wooden flooring over laminate or carpets. Plus, she and the kids had plans for a dog. Wooden floors would stand up much better to the rigours of a dog running up and down the floor hour after hour, day after day. The dog never materialised. Marcus refused to commit to taking it for a walk every day. He was the only one in the house who didn't want a dog, yet he was the one that had to make that commitment in the event that nobody else was willing to do the chore that day. When he couldn't make that commitment, the idea for a dog went out of the window. Every now and again, Ellie would bring the subject back up, but Marcus was adamant. Each time again she spoke to him about it, the determination in her voice waned. The last 3 parcels were still laid on the floor next to him. Marcus waited until the noise from the car died down. It didn't sound like the neighbour's car. They had one of those diesels that everyone bought before the VW emissions scandal. It didn't sound exactly like a tractor, but had a similar tone when it was idling. Marcus did an eeny, meeny, miny, moe with the 3 remaining parcels. It wasn't scientific, but none of this was. As the car turned off its engine outside, Marcus wondered how much time he might have to open the last 3 boxes, hoping he would find something inside that could clear his name. When he was a kid, he knew the sequence and could start with the right person to get the results he needed. But that was decades ago, so he just started on the left and said the rhyme as best he could remember from childhood. It was the middle parcel again. Fate was telling him something. As he opened the parcel, his eyes widened. "This is the one," Marcus said, as he pulled a small security box out of the cupboard under the stairs. He placed the item into the empty box and spun the dials to secure it. He then placed it deep into his pocket. Chapter 15. Gary and Ash arrived at Marcus Bright's home. Both were just heading home for the day, but the call came through. Gary's car was playing up, the handbrake slipping off even after he'd put it on securely. So he didn't take a risk with it. Ash had offered to drive him backwards and forwards to work that day and the next, while it was back with the Citroen dealership, getting checked out. Gary had looked online and found that many other people on internet forums were reporting the same issue. Hopefully, it would get fixed and Gary could park with peace of mind. They pulled up at the address, Gary checking it on the piece of paper that was put in his hand by Electra. "This is the one," Gary said, looking at the property, peeking out from behind the hedge. "Oh, let's go then," Ash said, looking at a set of keys that had been put in his hand by Electra. She sure was organised. The afternoon sun was setting behind the row of houses, the drizzle from earlier in the day changing to a late afternoon flurry of sunshine. Ash had always admired the way the Northeast did this. No matter how crappy the first part of the day was, it always seemed to make an effort at the end of the day, giving you hope for the following day. "Which key?" Gary asked, looking at Ash's hand. "This one looks like a front door key to me. How about you?" Ash replied. "Looks as good as any," Gary responded. Ash wondered why he'd bothered asking in the first place. As he offered up the key to the lock, it slid in neatly, as any new lock should. He turned the key 2 full revolutions in an anti-clockwise direction, and the door opened. As soon as Ash was inside, he was jumped upon, with blows raining down on his head. The struggle forced the door shut again with Gary on the outside, Ash and the keys on the inside with the assailant. Ash covered his head, hoping that the attacker would run out of energy and slow down, not that there was much sign of that happening. Gary looked along the side of the house, hoping for another means of entry. The new lock and the heavy door suggested that he would have some struggle getting inside that way. Looking along the left side of the property, there was nothing. The house had been built so close to the neighbour's property that a window would have meant each household being able to see straight into each other's home. Gary went back past the front door, seeing a struggle continuing inside. The other side of the property had a window, slightly ajar. Gary stepped up on a loose brick that was sticking out of the side of the building and climbed inside. Ash waited for a break in the proceedings to free up his hands and fight back. It was a good 30 seconds before he could hear heavy breathing from the person who was hitting him over the head repeatedly. Ash pushed them back, the man landing on his backside, looking up at Ash. He jumped to his feet, lunging at Ash before he had regained full height. Ash's knee gave way as the man landed on top of him, pushing Ash's back against the skirting board. Ash yelped in pain, trying to hold both his back and knee at the same time. The man stood over Ash, ripping an item out of a small parcel that was sat on the stairs. Ash looked past the man and saw a pile of parcels. At that point, he looked up at the man who had removed a Swiss Army knife from the parcel and was checking out the different blades, deciding which one to use on him. When he decided the blade that would help to set him free, he reached down towards the man who was in his home. Marcus paused for half a second, wondering who the man was and why they had got a key to his place. The half a second was enough. A blow to the back of the head from Gary knocked Marcus Bright out. The 2 detectives searched Marcus. "What's this?" Gary asked, as he pulled a box out of his pocket with a combination lock on. "Oh, let's take it with us," Ash said, rubbing the top of his head, searching for bumps. There were none present immediately, but he was sure that they would appear later on that evening. Gary stuffed it in his pocket. Gary looked at the rest of the home to see if there was anything else that might shed light on why Marcus Bright had returned home while Ash called for an ambulance. The man wasn't badly injured, but he was unconscious. Better that he get checked out before they brought him back to the station for questioning. "I'll go with him in the ambulance," Gary stated. "Are you sure?" Ash replied. "Yeah, I don't have a car anyway. And I hit him.
If they needed details on what happened, then I can fill them in with it all. I'll grab a set of handcuffs from your car if I can. Best to have him secured to a hospital bed now we've finally got him."
"Good idea. I'll tidy up here and head off for the day if you're okay with that," Ash asked out of politeness. He had every intention of signing off for the day and resting his aching head in front of the television.
"Yep, you get your beauty sleep. I don't need any," Gary smirked.
Within a minute, the ambulance was there, Gary explaining what had happened as the paramedics loaded Marcus Bright onto a stretcher. They checked his breathing, pulse, and looked into his eyes before getting the stretcher into the ambulance. Gary followed in the back with one of the paramedics, while the other jumped into the driver's seat. They were off and away. The Queen Elizabeth Hospital in nearby Gateshead was the destination. Gary could tell that they weren't too concerned about Marcus Bright's condition, as they didn't use the sirens on the journey. Arriving at the hospital, Marcus Bright was wheeled into a private room, Gary following to attach the handcuffs to the bed he was assigned. The doctor arrived in the room, asking Gary to wait outside. He decided that this was a good time to grab something from the vending machine. Gary could feel his energy levels slumping. A can of pop and a chocolate bar would give him a burst of energy and keep him going until he could head home. Gary walked along the corridor towards a secluded vending machine that seemed to be topped up with sweet treats from front to back. As he walked, a figure came out of a room behind him and started to follow. Chapter 16. Marcus woke up and immediately tried to get up. His wrist pulled him back. On further inspection, he was chained to a hospital bed. "What the hell am I doing here?" he said to himself, looking at the metal mechanism on the side of the bed to see if he could free himself. It looked like one of those metal puzzles you got in Christmas crackers, where if you knew the secret, you could move one piece of metal against another and present two separate parts instead of the one single part that you started with. Marcus moved the handcuffs along the bed, trying not to make a noise as he did so. The bottom corner, closest to the head of the bed, looked like it was far weaker than the rest of the mechanism. Marcus maneuvered the handcuffs there and pulled as hard as he could. As the handcuff tore into his skin, he held his other hand over his mouth to muffle the yelp. Marcus looked up and could see someone outside, looking like they were pacing backwards and forwards past the door. They looked like a sentry guard on duty. Trying to put the pain out of his mind, Marcus did the same thing again. This time, the rusty metal fraying away from the side of the bed, far enough for Marcus to release the handcuffs around the back of it and free his hands. Now, time to get out of there. Chapter 17. Gary was lying on the floor of a broom cupboard. A blow to the head as he passed the room left it easy for his assailant to catch him and shuffle the last few feet through the door with Gary's limp yet heavy body in his hands. "I'll take that," were the only words Gary heard as the man searched his pockets. Gary was helpless to resist. The throbbing pain in his head worsened every time Gary moved. He wanted to lie there for hours on end, letting the headache subside like he would a hangover. But he knew the fact that he was on the floor of a cupboard in a hospital meant that someone else was in danger. The rest would have to come later. Now he knew how Ash felt. Bringing himself to his knees before attempting the full ascent, Gary pushed the pain to the back of his mind, trying to focus on his warm bed with his partner Agnes looking after him. All he had to do was get up, get out of there, and secure Marcus Bright. Then he could sound the alarm and get some medical attention himself. Gary used his hands to walk their way up the front of his thighs, straightening his body as he did so. Leaning on a shelf that smelled of cleaning chemicals, Gary felt a rush of pain run from his jaw through and out the top of his head. He stumbled forward, catching the door handle as he stumbled. Rattling the door handle confirmed the fear he had that it had been locked. Gary felt trapped, panicking and banging on the door with both fists
as loudly as his head could stand. It felt like hours before someone arrived at the other side of the door.
"What are you doing in there?" the voice asked.
Gary fumbled around in the dark, hoping that he could find a light switch and the light wouldn't be too strong. He pressed the palm of his hand against the walls, hoping that he would get lucky and bump into the light switch. It was actually on the outside of the room. Gary could have spent all night in there and not found it. Suddenly, the light flooded the room, and Gary pulled his left arm across his face. It felt like a 100-watt bulb, the kind his grandfather insisted on in every room when Gary was young. Visiting grandfather felt like it was an inquisition to Gary. Bright lights always shone in his face. The lock shook, and then the door opened, revealing a less harsh light and a figure that didn't look happy at someone in his cleaning cupboard.
"I'm sick of you buggers pissing around in there. You're not the first person I've had to remove from this room this week. I blame the stag parties. I'm calling security," the cleaner said in a stern voice, making Gary shield from the noise as much as the light. No need," Gary replied. "There's every need. I want you off the premises."
Gary flashed his badge.
"Police. I was hit over the head and locked in here. In fact, call security now," Gary replied, changing his instruction. "Make your mind up. Do you want security or not?" the cleaner asked, sounding as confused as Gary felt after the blow to the head.
Gary took off in the direction of Marcus Bright's room, with the voice of the cleaner following him along the corridor. As he reached the door of the room, he noticed that it wasn't properly closed. Before that, Gary had witnessed all of the hospital personnel being incredibly careful to ensure that the door was closed whenever they entered or left the room. He kicked the door, not wanting to touch the handle. Gary had a feeling that he needed to keep his hands free. As he opened the door wide and looked inside, the window was open. There was no sign of Marcus Bright. Gary turned around to see the cleaner with a security guard stood behind him. The man was a colossus, standing at around 7 foot tall, looking like he was almost as wide. Not quite all muscle, but a chest and biceps that had been honed by years in the gym. Gary was happy that he had time to explain. He didn't fancy being led from the premises by that guy. Just the slightest nudge would have felled him. "Are you the cop?" the security guard asked, with a voice suitably deep for such a frame.
"Yes, that's me. Can I take a look at your CCTV? Please."
Gary found some manners at the last second. It wasn't his usual style, but something about this giant of a man brought about Gary's best behavior. "Follow me," was the reply. Gary did what he was told. That didn't happen very often. It was a full 5 minutes before they reached the office with control room written on the door. The man walked ahead, Gary behind. Not a word said between them. "What do you want to see?" the man asked, plonking himself into a chair that bounced down and then up under the weight.
"What do you have in the corridor outside the room Marcus Bright was in?"
"The room where I first met you," the security guard asked, sounding like it took him ages to grasp the simplest instruction.
"Yes, that's the one. What's there? Can you manage that?"
Gary asked, increasing in confidence, decreasing in patience. "There's a camera outside of that room. From what time?"
"Shall we start with half an hour before we first met?" Gary instructed, using the point of reference that the giant of a man already had. It was easier this way.
The pair of them watched the images on the screen in front of them. A man who looked like a bearded version of Marcus Bright paced up and down outside the door, speaking on the phone. After around 10 minutes of talking, the man entered the room. All they could see at that point were shadows moving across the light. Gary's frustration grew. He wanted to be able to maneuver the camera into the room and watch what was going on. Detective work would be so much easier if that was possible, if there were cameras watching every move of every person on the planet. A minute or two later, the man emerged with Marcus, still in a hospital gown. The man had Marcus propped up under his shoulder, moving him along at speed where only one foot was in contact with the ground every few seconds. Gary was reminded of a racehorse, spending more time in the air than in contact with the surface. That was about the only fact that Gary knew about racehorses, save one. The other fact that he could rely on was that if he put his money on the horse, it was bound to lose. "Follow him," Gary instructed. The security guard started to rise from his chair. "No, on the screens," Gary explained, shaking his head at the slow-witted nature of the man that he had to rely on to rescue the day. The man was far more adept with CCTV systems than he was with comprehending the English language, and he followed Marcus and his unknown lookalike all the way from the corridor to the car park. Gary took note of the registration number of the car as the security guard showed the car leaving the hospital grounds and turning right. "Right. Thank you very much for all your help," Gary said, as he rose to his feet.
"Wait a minute," the security guard said. "I need to look at the beginning again."
Gary didn't stop getting up, thinking that the man wanted to watch again for his own pleasure. As he grabbed his coat and stretched, rubbing his aching head, Gary was stopped in his tracks by the position of the security guard. He had his face pressed up to the glass like a child who hadn't been told by their parent that it wasn't good for their eyes.
"The phone isn't on," the security guard exclaimed.
"What?"
"He looks like he's on the phone, but there's no light from it, no illumination. He's pretending to be on the phone."
"Well, that fucks up another possible lead. Thanks for that," Gary replied. The security guard couldn't work out if the detective stood in front of him was being sarcastic or not. Then he decided he didn't care. By the time he sat down again, Detective Gary Hole had left the room. Chapter 18. Both Gary and Ash spent the night nursing sore heads. Neither got much in the way of sleep. Gary was on the phone to Ash around 6 the next morning for a lift to work. Ash was already up, drinking coffee to see if it gave him a bit of a spark that his lack of sleep had taken from him. While stirring the coffee and deciding whether to add some cold water, Ash tried to estimate how much sleep he'd actually had. Putting together the pieces, he figured that he had half an hour on the settee before dragging himself off to bed. Then he laid awake until around 3, before nodding off for an hour and a half. Then he had laid there since 4:30. He kept telling himself it was rest if he laid really still, but no matter how much he tried to persuade himself that he'd had enough rest, the tiredness hit pretty much as soon as he'd decided to get up. Gary would be ready in 20 minutes, he'd said. That gave Ash 10 minutes to get ready and head out of the door. The two of them would be the first to the police station. Ash was sure of that. But there was a peace in working there without the hustle and bustle of later in the day, and with the throbbing in his head still knocking away, he needed something far from hustle and bustle. Ash sat outside Gary's house. He wanted to get the guy's attention. Couldn't sound the horn, far too early. No phone signal. What part of a town in the modern day didn't have a phone signal? Ash turned the engine off and resolved to go back to old school. Knock on his door. As he opened the door, he spotted movement in the wing mirror. Closing the door and looking more closely, he saw Gary approach the car from the rear. "Morning," he said, getting into the passenger side.
"Morning. Where have you been?"
"I said I'd be ready in 20 minutes. When you were late, I thought I'd grab some fresh air," Gary replied.
"And was it?" Ash asked.
"Was what?" Gary replied.
"The air. Was it fresh?"
"Yes, enough riddles. My head hurts enough as it is."
"Me too," Ash responded as he pulled off. "So, what happened?" Ash asked as he drove slowly towards the station.
"Oh, I got hit over the head and dragged into a cleaner's cupboard. The guy who did it, I suspect, is the same one who took Marcus Bright from his room. Not sure how he got his handcuffs off, but he took the guy away."
"What do you mean you suspect it's the same guy?"
"There was no CCTV in the corridor where I was whacked. But everything adds up. He had the registration plate checked last night. The car was reported stolen from outside a property in Solgrave the other morning. Was there when they went to bed, missing when they got up, and I've been sent a message to say that it was found left outside the same property again in the early hours of this morning."
"So it was borrowed rather than stolen?" Ash asked, with a hint of mischief in his voice.
"You could say that. We've got forensics going over to take a look at it. Hopefully we get something, because this case smells of nothing right now. And you know what happens to a case when you can't smell it, don't you, Ash?"
"What?"
"You lose the scent."
The two of them got out of the car as Ash pulled up at the police station, walking single file, both men rubbing their heads and deep in their own thoughts. Gary wanted to get the man who had hit him over the head. He didn't like being hurt at the best of times. Being attacked was how he saw it. Ash wanted to know why this man was helping Marcus Bright get away. Who was he? A relative? A friend? He must be someone incredibly sure of Marcus Bright's innocence if he was willing to strike a detective to get Marcus out of there. But where were they headed?
"Gary, why did this man want Marcus Bright?" "What do you mean?"
"Well, if he wants Marcus free, then there has to be more of a plan than just spring him from hospital. Does he prove his innocence, or does he get him out of the country?"
"I already thought of the second one," Gary responded. "We've got a search out for him at all the ports and airports. Plus, we got a police officer to visit his address and secure his passport. He won't be leaving the country, not by any conventional means at any rate."
"So that leaves Marcus being proven innocent as the other possible explanation. That doesn't seem particularly likely now, does it, given all we know?"
"No," Gary replied. As the two men sat and looked at something and nothing at the same time, the door opened and Augustine walked in.
"I thought I was the only one who couldn't sleep," Augustine spoke as he closed the door behind him. "Morning, Gus," Ash said.
"Morning, Boyle," Gary added.
"So, are you two here because you have something in particular to investigate? Or is there some other reason you've beaten me into the office this morning?" Ash and Gary took it in turns to fill Augustine in on the events that had happened the previous day. Augustine had the bare bones in texts from the two men, but there was nothing like hearing it face to face. Augustine made notes every now and again, piecing together the afternoon and evening that the pair of them had experienced. Augustine wished he was there every step of the way with every team member. Like a fly on the wall, but that wasn't the way the world worked. "And the car was left back at the same address in Solgrave?" Augustine asked out loud to the room as he read back through the notes.
"Yes,"
they replied in unison. "And the forensics are checking it out this morning?"
"Yes,"
the dual reply came again. "So we head to Solgrave. That's my spin on things," Augustine spoke, still looking down at the pad in front of him, perched on the desk. "Sounds like a plan to me, Gus," Ash replied. Chapter 19. As the three of them arrived and pulled up the car directly behind the one that had been stolen and returned, Ash looked out through the gap in between the front seats. He'd volunteered to sit in the back, likened it to being a kid. He could see another car pulling up and parking in front of the car in question. Someone got out of the car that all three of them recognized. It was the head of forensics. He opened his boot, hidden from view for a few seconds, before reappearing with a briefcase in his left hand. The right hand already had a latex glove on. Then he swapped the case to his other hand and placed a glove on the left. He was ready to do business. "Hi, Ian," Gary said, remembering the man from previous investigations. Augustine and Ash remembered him from previous investigations too, and were already heading in the opposite direction. "Detective Hole, how are you?" Ian Mallon, the head of forensics, asked. "Good, good. You?" Gary replied, starting to realize why the other two had disappeared. Ian Mallon had a reputation for taking a brief encounter and turning it into an hour-long conversation, and none of that hour was interesting. Yes, I am very good. Looking forward to using these beauties on this car, Malin said, tapping his briefcase knowingly. Gary didn't want to know what was inside, but he knew that if he hung around any longer, he'd find out. Got to go, and need to catch the other two up. Same case as you and that car. We'll be back soon for an update, Gary said, walking away, trying to drown out the words from Ian Malin as he broke into a jog. Enjoy that, Ash smirked as Gary caught the other two up. It's only a delay. He'll be there, waiting to give us an update when we get back, Gary responded, trying to fight fire with fire. We'll let you deal with that, Ash pushed back. You're obviously well acquainted. This is the property, Augustine said, walking around to the rear of the place that reported the car missing. He wanted to step away from the petty squabbles and get down to business. The stern voice told the other two that he meant business. And why are we round the back? Gary asked. Well, these places have access front and back. The fact that the person who took the car also brought it back meant that they knew most of the habitable rooms are at the back of the house. I've been in one of these before, and I know that the front contains the hall, bathroom, and a small bedroom. Everything else is at the back of the house: kitchen, living room, and main bedrooms. You are unlikely to disturb someone if you approach from the front. And that means? Gary asked, looking to be led rather than to lead. It means that the person who took the car most probably knew the layout of these properties. If all he wanted was a car for a day or two, then he had the choice of any street or any car park in the whole of Washington, or even the surrounding areas. So, why did he choose here? The fact he knew his chances of success were high. So, he lives here? Ash asked. Or he used to, but the fact that the car was returned to this address steers me to the first conclusion, Augustine replied, starting to walk along the back of the other houses on the row. As they reached the end property, Augustine spotted a trail of 2 muddy footmarks across the grass verge and onto the pavement. They led a route to the front door of the property. The freshness of the mud suggested that these had been left there in the previous few hours. Let's knock on a few doors. Shall we start with this one? Augustine asked, as the other two followed his lead. Gary pressed ahead of the other two and rapped his knuckles on the door. Just as he did that, something was thrown out of the window from directly above the front door, landing in the front garden. Firework! Ash shouted, and the 3 of them took shelter behind a bush, hoping that the offending firework shot off in the opposite direction. No such luck, as the banger whizzed toward the trio of detectives, dissecting them as 2 diving one way and 1 diving the other. As the noise reverberated against the hard plastic frame under the window, the 3 of them covered their ears. Looking up, Augustine saw movement across the back of the property. This way, he said, giving chase and assuming that the other 2 would follow. Ash was soon on his feet, following. Gary had taken a blow to the leg from the firework and was busy pulling his trouser leg up to assess the damage and put out the smouldering starts of a fire around the knee of his trousers. Ash had soon caught up and overtaken Augustine, stealing his stare on the back of the head of the man who had left the property at some speed. Ash wasn't able to make up any ground on the fleer, but he wasn't getting further away at the same time. The man looked over his shoulder and decided to change tactics from a straight foot race. He had the speed, but wasn't sure he had the stamina. The bushes that ran along the edge of Solgrave hid a pathway, and beyond that a series of fields. Ash followed the man on the track, losing his footing on the soft gravel that had been loosened by the rain the previous day. As he regained composure, Ash looked right, expecting the man to have travelled in that direction, still moving away from the door they had knocked on. But the man had doubled back and was now running along the track in the direction he'd come from along the adjoining road. The irony of the fact that the man was probably on a couple of feet from Augustine forced Ash to grimace. There was nothing he could do about it. Ash gave chase again. By this time, the gap had tripled to what it was when he gave chase on the street. But Ash couldn't get any traction on the gravel track in his work shoes. He tried to keep an even pace without toppling over. The man almost disappeared into the distance as Ash and Augustine stayed on the track chasing behind. At the next gap between the road and the track, Ash returned to the steadier surface,
hearing the small stones fall out of the grooves in his shoes and onto the hard surface. Augustine stayed on the track, his stamina coming into play. When he was young, Augustine ran cross-country in the winter, athletics in the summer. He was a middle-distance and long-distance runner, not much in the way of speed, but felt in those days like he could keep running all day. Not quite having the same feeling of perpetual motion, Augustine still knew where his strengths lay. Slow and steady might not always win the race, but it would put him in a position where he had a chance. And that's all he needed with this guy, to still be standing when the runaway had run out of energy and stopped. Every now and again, Augustine could see Ash through the bushes, a few paces ahead, but not much more than that. The man who had fled the property was still in his view, but extending his lead. Augustine opened up his stride, hoping to keep the man in sight for as long as possible. On one side was a maze of houses, the other a network of fields. As soon as he was out of sight, he could disappear to one of 100 different places. Ash was breathing heavily. Augustine could hear that. Their days of talking about sport were more frequent than their days of playing sport. At that point in time, Augustine resolved to go for more runs, play more squash, and get off his backside more often. It was always the same when he was chasing after someone. He made all the right resolutions. Just once he stopped running, all of that resolve dissipated into nothing but guilt. The man leaving the scene upped his pace. The two detectives were starting to get left behind. Ash had nothing left in the tank to increase his speed. Augustine didn't have much in the way of speed to begin with. As they reached the end of the alleyway, they had three choices: straight ahead to a housing estate, left to another, or right to the fields. Looking across, there was no movement in the fields.
"He has to be back there,"
Ash said, pointing towards Solgrave through heavy breaths.
"Fuck it,"
Augustine replied, not wanting to go into the rabbit warren chasing after a man who could be anywhere, inside or outside the maze of properties, alleys and garages. They headed off in the direction Ash pointed, looking left and right as they went for any signs that the man they were looking for was close. After a few seconds, Augustine heard a voice in the distance.
"Detectives!"
He pricked his ears up, trying to locate the direction of the voice. It went again.
"Detectives!"
Then there was a shout from another location, maybe a different voice this time.
"Detectives!"
Ash looked at Augustine for guidance. He had none. They listened as 20 voices from different parts of the estate joined in. Ash felt like he was at a strange football match, where the chant was only sung by one person at a time. They walked along through the estate towards the house where they last saw Gary and the car they left behind. As they walked, the echoes of the word repeated through the neighborhood like an early warning system. Augustine pictured people hiding their criminal deeds across the estate as they heard someone call that detectives were present. There was no chance they would find that man with all the commotion going on. People were starting to walk out of their properties, staring at the two detectives walking their way back through. As they walked, Augustine spotted wire hanging from a building and glistening in the autumn-winter sun.
"Gus, what's the deal?"
"We head back to the car and find out the information from the forensics. Hopefully that sheds some light on the case.
Then
I think it's time to speak to Marcus Bright's children."
"Is that wise?"
"It is if we ask Electra and Alice to do it. I think we need subtlety here. No point in us men going in there. Crash, bang, wallop."
"Speak for yourself, Gus."
Chapter 20. Gary could hear the shouts across the estate. He wondered whether Augustine and Ash were safe, but there was little he could do. The pain in his leg needed treatment, as it had gone from aching to biting. He'd called an ambulance and was sat in the passenger seat of Ian Mallon's car. Mallon was sat in the driver's seat, explaining what had been found. The initial tests had come back with DNA from 3 people: the owner of the car, their wife, and Marcus Bright.
"But that means that Marcus Bright stole the car,"
Gary said out loud, letting the thoughts inside his head wander.
"There's no evidence that anyone who shouldn't have been in the car was actually in the car. apart from Marcus Bright, Ian Mallon explained, in a way that only he could. But that can't be true. I saw someone put Marcus Bright in the passenger seat and then drive away. I've seen it with my own eyes, Gary mused. And did you see this in the flesh? Mallon asked. No, CCTV, Gary replied. Ah, then you haven't seen it with your own eyes. The things they can do with technology now means that they could put a dinosaur in the passenger seat of the car and you wouldn't question the authenticity. Their work is that good. But this is CCTV system at a hospital. I saw the footage no more than half an hour after it happened in real life. I don't understand what could have happened. Well, forensics are telling you that there is only one piece of rogue DNA here, and the work we do is scientific. The DNA doesn't lie in the same way your suspects do. It's one of the reasons I like doing this job instead of yours. I don't get lied to. I don't have to decide if I'm being told the truth or not. I know from the words on the page in front of me what's truthful and what's not. And here we are. This is the truth. Gary scratched his head as he heard two noises. The first was the sound of footsteps that accompanied the sight of Augustine and Ash around the corner. The shouts that had followed them through the neighbourhood had stopped. The second sound was the sirens of the ambulance, accompanied by the flashing blue lights. Gary was on his way to hospital to get his leg seen to. As soon as he saw the ambulance, the pain increased. Something to do with the association of seeing the flashing blue lights, he told himself. How are we doing, Gary? Ash asked as he came into sight of his colleague. Tell me you got him, Gary asked. Does it look like we have him? Ash replied, looking at the floor around where he stood. All right, smart-ass. Tell me you got something. Gary modified his question, not that it changed the answer. Nothing. You? Ash replied, nodding towards Ian Mallon. The only DNA in here that shouldn't be belongs to Marcus Bright, Augustine asked. Correct. So we're no further forward than when we got here, are we? Gary inquired. Maybe, maybe not. I think we've got some degree of certainty that the person who ran away from us lives on this estate, probably in this address here. Shall we check this out while you get checked out, Gary? Augustine asked, seeing the ambulance crew making their way towards the car. Gary and the ambulance crew got down to their business. Augustine and Ash knocked again on the door of the property that had first attracted their attention. They got the reply they expected. Absolute silence. It didn't take long for Ash's boot to work its way through the door, loosening the lock from the frame as he did so, and the two men were inside. The smell was damp mixed with chip pan fat. Not the most pleasant of welcomes, but both men had smelled far worse at the scene of a crime. A quick inspection of the downstairs revealed nothing of note except from the smell. It didn't look like the place was occupied. None of the usual signs that a property was in use, like food in the fridge or a warmth that was brought about by human occupation. Upstairs brought more of the same, only the upstairs had a very different smell, the sulphur of fireworks. But there was still the same background smell of damp. Answering his phone, Augustine received the news he expected from Alice. She'd been asked to look up the residents of the address. There were none. But she had the name of the landlord. Augustine would give him a call to answer a few basic questions, like how long it had been vacant, who might have a key, and what security measures he had in place. But he didn't expect a great deal of joy in that line of the investigation. The two men left the property just as the locksmith turned up to secure the place. The police would foot the bill for that one. Augustine would speak to Marie, his boss, to clear it all up and get her to authorize paying for the damage. A couple of £100 at the most, if only it was that easy to find a killer, Augustine thought. I'd pay £200 from my own pocket to find Marcus Bright, he said to Ash, wondering why his face was one of confusion. Then he realized that Ash wasn't part of his internal monologue. Well, you paid more than me, Gus. Bigger house, bigger car, bigger paycheck, and bigger mortgage. What did you say at the end? Bigger mortgage. Ash, I think we need to speak to Marcus Bright's employers.
Chapter 21. Alice and Electra arrived at the hotel where Marcus Bright's children were staying with their aunt. Calling ahead, they had asked for an hour to speak to the children. The protective aunt granted them half an hour, 15 minutes with each child. With Marcus still on the loose and the suspected killer, the aunt didn't want much attention brought to the whereabouts of the kids. She knew they would never have a normal life again, but she wanted to protect their normality as much as possible. "I don't trust the police, never had," the aunt greeted the pair of them as they met in the lobby of the Eslington Villa Hotel in nearby Gateshead. "And the fact that you've still not caught the man who killed my sister doesn't endear me any more to your kind." Alice looked at Electra, whose skin was turning from her usual pale look to something more red. She knew she had to do something. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Bray. We really appreciate it, and speaking to the children might help us bring the man to justice." "You mean Marcus Bright? Is that who you mean when you say the man? I don't like people who talk in riddles either," the aunt replied. Electra looked at her clothing, all pockets and buttons. "At this moment in time, we'd desperately like to speak to Marcus Bright, yes," Alice replied. "I told my sister she was better than him from the moment they met. Never saw in him what she saw. Not that I ever thought he'd do this. Shall we grab a cup of tea before I take you up to see the kids?" the aunt inquired, pointing towards the grand sitting room adjacent to the lobby. "Yes, let's," Alice replied, seeing Electra's shade return to something more like normal. Over tea, the two detectives chatted to the aunt about anything but the death of her sister. Alice saw this as an opportunity to build a bridge between them and Mrs. Bray. The last thing they wanted was a breakdown in communication. If Marcus Bright had killed their mother, then it stood that the children potentially weren't safe. If the aunt refused access, then they couldn't check up on them, or find out any vital information the kids had. After they had chatted and the aunt had drunk copious amounts of Earl Grey, she looked straight up and asked, "Do you want to see them now?" "Yes, please," Electra answered, relaxing into the situation. "Come on then," the aunt said as she got up, explaining the situation as they climbed the stairs. "I've told them that their mother has been killed, but they don't know their father's involvement. I'd rather it stayed that way. They've been asking after Dad, but I've told them that he's trying to help the police find out who killed Mum. I couldn't think of any other way to put it. The youngest is Abby, the eldest Frankie. They're both very dear children, and I'm trying my best to keep it that way. Do you understand?" "Yes," both Alice and Electra said at the same time. They were at the door, a light knock by the aunt before using the keycard to open the door and enter the room. "Hey kids, these are the nice police ladies I told you about. They are here to help find the person who, well, they are here to help you. Can you answer a few questions for them?" The children nodded. The aunt pulled her phone from an inside pocket of her jacket and opened the stopwatch app. 15 minutes, she said, grabbing Abby's hand and walking her over to the other side of the room. The 15 minutes passed as though they were only 2. Alice and Electra had to ask the same questions several times as they looked for a gentle way of asking if their parents fought and what that looked like. The closest they got was that their father had once called their mother a pig years before, but when they dug around for context, it was part of a farmyard game they were playing as a family. By the time the aunt got over and swapped the kids around, Alice and Electra wondered what they were doing there. Chatting to the young girl was different. She was far more chatty, but no more revealing. Alice had mirrored the aunt by getting the stopwatch app on her phone going. She knew they only had a couple of minutes left. She wanted to make a connection, but that wasn't easy with kids that were so traumatized. She changed track from the relationship between the parents to the relationship with her father. "Abby, can you tell me what your dad is like?" "He is good most of the time." "Most of the time?" "Yes, but not all of the time." "No." "And what does your dad do when he's not good?" "He isn't bad." "So what is he?" "He's different." "Different how?" "It is like Dad has 2 personalities."
Chapter 22. Augustine called the landlord of the property where they'd encountered a firework and a runaway. He wanted to find out a few things. The phone rang 5 times before an answer. "Speak!" the voice at the other end of the line went. "Is this Anth King?" Augustine asked, put off his stride by the way the man answered the phone. "Yeah, what do you want?" the reply came, as though the man had only a few seconds to spare. "My name is Detective Boyle from Washington Police. I'd like to ask you a few questions about a property that belongs to you." "Which one? I've got hundreds," the man boasted. "Actually, you have 11, Augustine responded, relying on the information he had been given by Alice. He trusted her research implicitly. "Okay, you know your stuff. Which one? I've got 11, Anth King replied, with much less bravado. "It's Manor Road." "Oh, that one. Can't seem to get it rented out. What do you want to know?" "Let's start at the beginning. How long has it been vacant?" "Almost a year now. I've got the mortgage company on my case, always asking about their monthly payment. I've told them if I can't get someone to pay me, then how on earth can I pay them? They don't seem to want to listen." "Well, that's mortgage companies," Augustine replied. "And what security measures do you have in place?" "On that place? Well, it's got a front door, hasn't it? And a lock?" "Well, not the one that was on there this morning, it hasn't," Augustine replied. "What do you mean?" "Well, we've had to enter the property to secure it, and there's a new lock on there, courtesy of Washington Police." "What the fuck happened there? Sorry, am I allowed to swear at a detective? I don't know the protocol here." "It's not against the law." "Good, but I'd rather you didn't." "Okay." "We were led to the address, knocked on the door when someone threw a firework at us from the upstairs front window." "Fuck." "Again, I'd rather you didn't, but we said similar words at the time. Anyway, that leads to my third question. Who might have a key to the place?" "The lettings agent has a key, not that they get me much in the way of viewings." "Anyone else?" "There was one tenant who just disappeared and didn't hand in their key. I got the lettings agent to chase them, but it was like they vanished off the face of the earth." "Can you remember their name?" "Yeah, it's etched in my mind. He was called Marcus Bright." Chapter 23. Augustine came off the phone so he and Ash could speak to the employer. "Let's make this quick. We've got bigger fish to fry," Augustine said, as they waited for someone to answer the door. Security had tightened since they learned that one of their employees was the prime suspect in a murder case and was still on the loose. "Why? What's up?" Ash asked. "I'll tell you later," Augustine replied, as the door was opened from the inside by a leggy blonde receptionist who had slowly made her way over to the door as though her high heels and the freshly polished floor were a potential slip hazard. "I'm Jenny. You must be the detectives," she asked with a smile that looked as false as it was broad. "Yes, I'm Detective Boyle. This is Detective Planter. You can call us Augustine and Ash." "Well, Augustine and Ash, please come this way. We've set up a room for you to speak to people. You gave me a list of the people you wanted to question. It's Marcus Bright's secretary and his line manager. Anyone else?" "At the moment, that's it. But we will let you know if there's anyone else." "Cool. Cup of tea? Coffee?" the receptionist asked. "I'll have a black tea," Augustine replied. "Coffee, black," Ash added. "Make yourselves at home. I'll send Marcus's secretary through, and I'll be back in a couple of minutes with the drinks. Sugar?" "No thanks," both replied at once. Within the minute they were sat with Alicia, Marcus Bright's secretary, both nursing the warm cup in their hands to warm them from the bitter cold of the outside world. Autumn was definitely turning into winter in the northeast of England. "So, Alicia, how long have you worked for the firm?" Augustine asked, taking the lead. He could see Ash with a notepad and pen in his hand, so the roles were clearly defined. 3 years now." "And how long have you worked with Marcus?" "Pretty much 2 of those years give a week or 2. "And how would you describe him?" "He was an intense man when it came to his work. I'm used to working really closely with a financial advisor. I usually know how they tick, get involved with their caseloads and clients. But Marcus kept me at arm's length. I chased cases for him, but with the companies. I rarely spoke to his clients. He liked to keep all of that to himself." "And do you have a good working relationship?" "Not really. He has a temper at times. I've heard him say some pretty nasty things to life assurance providers when they haven't progressed his client's application as quickly as he'd like."
"Things like what?" Augustine asked, as he could see Ash's hand working overtime with pen and paper.
"Well, he threatened to slit someone's throat once. I know he didn't mean it, but his temper can get away from him at times. I stay in the background and let him get on with it when he's in a mood like that. It usually takes him an hour or so to calm back down again, but he never apologizes to anyone."
"So, what was he like on the morning of Wednesday the 31st of October?
"Was that the last time he worked here?"
"Yes, it was the last morning he was here. I understand he had an interview. How was he apart from that?"
"Distracted."
"Do you want to add any more? I mean, what do you mean by distracted?"
"Well, he just wasn't here. Physically, he turned up late and went out for something to eat in the morning before the interview. He had cleared his diary, so there were no appointments that day. Emotionally, he was somewhere else. I've seen him distracted before, but this was a whole new level. He might as well have not been in the room."
"And did he say why he was distracted?"
"He didn't say a word to me all day."
"Can you think of anything else we might need to know about Marcus, especially related to that morning?"
No, I can't think of anything."
"Well, here's my card. If you think of anything else, no matter how small, please give me a ring. If I don't answer, leave me a voicemail and I'll get back to you."
"Okay, Detective, I'll do that. Thank you."
"For what?"
"Keeping the streets safe from people like Marcus Bright."
"Oh, that's what we're here for." Chapter 24. Augustine and Ash sat and chatted as they waited for Marcus's line manager to come into the room. "There was a tenant at the address where we met the firework, called, let me guess, Gus. He was called Marcus Bright." "Yes." "So we need to tie this up quickly?" Ash asked. "Don't rush it, but I'd like to get back there and have a look around. The landlord is meeting us there in an hour." "Cool," Ash replied, blushing slightly. He liked the way it sounded on the lips of the receptionist and gave it a go. It wasn't the kind of word he usually uttered. "Cool," Augustine replied, mocking slightly. Chapter 25. Gary got out of his hospital bed. The burns on his leg weren't as bad as he first feared. A clean-up and a dressing later, he was ready to be discharged with a prescription for some strong painkillers in case it flared up again. Gary was already sure that he wouldn't be taking them. He had a toothache a decade or so earlier, pacing up and down with the pain. When he was given the painkillers, he took them immediately to try to soothe the pain. They did. He slept for 27 hours straight and vowed never to take anything stronger than paracetamol again. Picking up his jacket, Gary walked up and down, testing the strength in his leg, while waiting for the prescription. As he was given the piece of paper, the nurse said to him, "Stay safe and sound." And his mind went to the security guard, who had shown him the CCTV the day before. Gary's sense of direction wasn't great. Agnes, his new beau, always mocked him for his sense of place in the world. She would sit and ask him in their front room to point in the direction of the sea, of the town centre, of Sunderland, and he always got it wrong. The maze of corridors in a hospital weren't going to make his task any easier, but he felt he had time on his hands, so walked up and down, looking for the room with "Control Room" written on the door. Around 10 minutes later, he was there, through a case of perseverance rather than having any sense of where he was. Knock, knock. "Hello?" The voice from behind the door answered. "It's Detective Hole. I was here with you last night, looking at the CCTV. I have a couple of questions, if I can." Silence. Then, around 20 seconds later, the door opened slowly, the huge security guard peering through the gap, like he could hide his huge frame in the space.
How can I help? He asked, without opening the door more than an inch or two.
I have a few questions to ask about the images we looked at yesterday. Can I come in?
Suppose, the security guard answered, opening the door fully, looking both ways along the corridor before he followed Gary inside. What questions? The security guard asked, getting down to business.
Sorry, Gary replied.
You said you had a few questions. What are they? I'm a busy man.
Gary remembered the way the conversation went the first time with the huge guard. He was used to having the upper hand in any conversation because his size put him on the front foot. Gary was happy to play subordinate. All he wanted was some information. The chat he'd had with Ian Mallon had piqued his interest. He wanted to explore more. The CCTV images here, where are they stored? Gary inquired.
Hard disk.
So, on the system itself, not the cloud? Gary asked, having done some research on his mobile phone while he was sat waiting in his hospital bed. The nurse had told him to switch it off because it interfered with the electronics in the hospital. He didn't believe her, so continued. It seemed that CCTV images saved onto a hard disk had two issues. Firstly, they would automatically wipe after a certain period of time. Secondly, that they were much easier to manipulate. Gary didn't believe that there was time to mess around with the images between Marcus Bright disappearing and him witnessing the tapes, but he had to cover all bases.
On the system, it's on a month loop. Look at the 15th and it will show the most recent 15th of a month. Then on the 15th of the next month, it gets wiped over. It goes to stand that if something over a month old, it's not that important. So, the only dates that last longer than a month are the 30th of January, 31st of May, August, and October. Make sense?
Gary nodded. He was interested in the way the systems worked as much as asking questions about the case. And who has access to this?
There's a team of 6 in security. All of us could get hold of this if we needed to, and we're all trained on how to manipulate the system to get the information we need.
And could these images be doctored?
You mean the images I showed you yesterday?
No, I'm talking theoretically. Could any of the images you guys have be manipulated to show someone there who wasn't, or to remove someone who was?
I suppose if you have enough time and enough processing power, you would get the best results going down to the pixel level and working one by one. But that could take weeks of work to remove someone from even just a minute of footage. Do you know how long it takes them to put together a minute of an animation movie?
No, Gary replied.
A week.
What?
Yep, a week plus to render 1 minute of animation, and that's starting from scratch, not trying to manipulate images that already exist. I think it would take you months. Why do you ask?
You know, a little professional interest.
And do you think this might have happened with the images I showed you yesterday?
Not now, I don't.
But that's changing images. What if the CCTV footage I showed you had been filmed at an earlier date, and that's what I showed you? What if it was staged, so that it looks like what you wanted to see?
And might it have been?
Do you know what? I've wondered that myself for some time. There was one guy who worked here a while back, put everyone's back up most of the time. He knew some technical stuff that wasn't strictly legal, and one of the things he always asked about during his training was how to change the date and time on the footage. Nobody ever asks that.
And does he still work here?
No. Left a while back under a bit of a cloud. I reported him for fiddling with CCTV images. I was never sure what he was up to at the best of times. At the worst of times, he looked like he was trying to record scenes. I didn't know if he was secretly making a movie without equipment. I keep an eye on YouTube every now and again, but I've never seen anything using our images. The day it happens, I'll be the one who can say, I told you so. And I don't suppose you remember his name, can you? Yes, it was Marcus Bright. Chapter 26. Augustine and Ash sat patiently, waiting to speak to Marcus's line manager. The man was all bristle and self-importance when he finally walked through the door. Ash could imagine him stood outside the door for 5 minutes, doing nothing but making them wait to demonstrate how valuable he was. "You've not got long," was his greeting as he stepped towards the 2 detectives, offering a handshake. Both detectives accepted the offer of a handshake. Ash went first, and then waited for Augustine to admonish him as he made his greeting. He didn't. "Take a seat," the man said, pointing to the 2 seats that Ash and Augustine had only vacated a few seconds earlier. Ash smirked, trying to work the guy out. Augustine's head was more in a business mode. He didn't want to get caught up in a petty display of chest-puffing with a man who would be out of their hair in a matter of minutes. "Name?" Augustine asked, getting down to business as requested. "What?" "Name." "Sean McPherson." "Job title?" "What's this, mastermind? Do you want my specialist subject too?" Sean responded, chuckling. He was the only one laughing at his joke. "Hopefully your specialist subject is answering questions about Marcus Bright, so we can get out of here quickly and you can get on with your day," Augustine deadpanned. "Point taken," Sean conceded. "Shall we get on with things?" "That's better. You interviewed Marcus Bright on the morning of the 31st of October, I understand." "Yes." "And how was he?" "He seemed stressed, but this is a role that he has been after for some time now. I'm not sure he was any different to how I expected someone interviewing for a role that they have coveted for such a long time." "So he wasn't unduly agitated or aggressive?" "You're asking me if he came across like someone who had just killed his wife?" "No, not at all. I don't know the first thing about murder or cleaning up after one, but I don't think he had the blood of his wife under his fingernails or stuck to his skin anywhere, if that's what you're asking." "I suppose, in a roundabout way, that is what we're asking." "But about Marcus in general, how did you find him?" "Up and down. We're going through a batch of training at the moment regarding mental health and the warning signs to look out for if you want to help a colleague. Well, there was a list of 10 things. I'd say that Marcus has at least 8 of them." "And did you ever talk to Marcus about this?" "No. He didn't take interference lightly. He saw himself as a strong and capable man, as well as being a strong and capable financial advisor. I guess you've spoken to his secretary already?" "Yes," Augustine replied. "Well, I'm sure she's already told you that Marcus didn't like her support in a case. He wanted people to know that it was all his own work, and that's what Marcus Bright is like as a human being. He doesn't like anyone knowing his private business, never turns up to company socials or anything like that, just stays away." "And do you think he has things to hide?" Augustine asked. "Not being a killer, I don't. But I'm sure there are things in Marcus Bright's closet. If he doesn't have anything in his closet, then I'll bet he's the first person I've ever met that doesn't. And I'm not a betting man." "Is there anything else that you think we might need to know?" Augustine inquired. He liked to finish off every interview with this question. It was his catch-all that covered all bases. Sometimes it uncovered a seemingly innocuous comment that opened a case up. Not this time. "No. Can I go now?" was the only reply he got from Sean McPherson. Chapter 27. No sooner had they left the room and thanked the receptionist for her time, organisation and the hot drinks, Augustine's phone rang. "Gary," he answered, looking at the name on the display with a dash of confusion. Gary's usual method of operation was to ignore instruction and disappear. Trying to get him on the other end of the phone was almost impossible, and here he was calling.
Augustine could count the number of times this had happened on the fingers of one hand. Boyle? How are you, Gary? What? Oh, that. I'm fine. Cleaned up and dressed. Good. Boyle, we have a development. I've just spoken to the security guard who showed me the tape yesterday. He has suspicions about a former security guard there who was tampering with tapes. You'll never guess his name. I think I can. Marcus Bright. Yes. How did you guess? Gary asked, with more than a hint of sarcasm. Well, there's a former tenant of the house where you and the firework had a collision. He's also called Marcus Bright. I have an idea who killed Ellie Bright. We're headed to the property now to speak to the landlord. If you can make it here, then give me a ring and we'll go in together. Otherwise, I'll fill you in later. Bye. And that was that. Gary returned to the man of few words. Shall we get in the car and get moving? Ash asked Augustine as he looked at the ground, deep in thought. Gus? But Augustine was somewhere else. Ash would have to wait a few minutes while his boss worked his way through the differing pieces of evidence that were coming together as one in his head. Chapter 28. Augustine and Ash met the landlord at the property around 20 minutes later. Not a word had passed between the two men since they left the interview room. Ash could see that Augustine needed some time and space to get on with his processing. He was like a computer at times, working through all the different possibilities, eliminating those that weren't correct, leaving a smaller batch of data at the end of the process. As they pulled up at the property for the second time that day, Ash could see a glint in Augustine's eye. The landlord was already waiting, surveying the damage on the outside that the firework had done. I've seen worse, the landlord said, offering a handshake to the two detectives. Detective Boyle, Detective Planter, Augustine said as he shook hands. Shall we take a look inside? Sure thing. Has he been here much, do you know? The landlord, Anth King, asked. Not a clue, Ash responded, hoping to get in on what was causing Augustine's eye to glint with a knowingness. This is Marcus Bright. Did you ever meet him? Augustine asked. Yeah, when I handed over the property to him. Big guy, round 6 foot tall, 15 stone plus, dark hair, scruffy. That sounds like our guy. Well, not our guy, but a guy that might be our guy, Augustine spoke, riddling his way through the sentence. You okay, Gus? Ash asked, wondering what his boss was talking about. Yeah, never been better. Shall we go? Augustine responded to Ash, nodding towards the door. He was like a dog who had buried a bone and just realized where it was. Ash wanted to know where that bone was too, thanking the landlord as he left, following Augustine along the street. Gus, where are we going? I thought I heard something when we were here last. It was like there was more than a few people shouting at us. It was like there was some echoes, some playback. And when Gary told us about the man at the hospital, I just put 2 and 2 together. Everywhere we've turned, there's been a Marcus Bright. So, what if there's more than one Marcus Bright? Chapter 29. How do I get in the box? You don't. The two men sat there, having a staring contest. It lasted a full minute before either of them blinked, breaking the silence with a slight cough. You're living my life, the one I should have had. What? You're Marcus Bright, said the man who had delivered the package to Marcus's home and work on the morning Ellie was killed. Yes, and who are you? I'm Marcus Bright. What? I'm the identical twin that you never knew you had. You wouldn't know with the life you've lived that you were part of a partnership, and you never bothered to find out. When you were shipped off to a family in Fatfield, I was given to someone here. Nothing that went through the authorities, just a transaction between our parents and the people we actually called Mum and Dad. I bet that you thought yours were loving and caring, didn't you? Well, they brought me up with love and care, plus respect. You don't have any of that. Marcus Bright, the man who was married to Ellie, responded. What do you know about me? Your parents, those people who brought you up with love and care, didn't have enough love and care to take both of us on.
They made a deal with our biological parents to take on only one of us. It should have been me. I should have had all those privileges that you were given. I should have gone to a good school, got good qualifications, got a good job, married Ellie and had kids. You have no higher status than me. You stole the life I should have had. I was born first, a full 2 minutes before you. You killed my Ellie? Marcus asked, sobbing at the thought of anyone touching her. She should have been mine. I asked her if she wanted to be mine. Come away with me and start a life together, her and the kids. But she didn't want that. Well, if I couldn't have her, then I certainly wasn't going to leave her for you. Now all I need is what I think is in that box. So I'll ask again. How do I get in the box? And I'll answer again. You don't. It's as simple as that. The man who had Marcus Bright captured, his identical twin, if he were to be believed, reached inside a pocket for a knife. He held it high so Marcus could see it clearly. Over the years, he had learned that the fear of pain was at least as powerful as the pain itself. It wasn't the first time that the man had to torture someone for information, and he found that people spoke long before he let the cold steel of the knife touch their flesh. The sight of a big knife loosened lips in his experience. But Marcus wasn't going to let go easily. In the box was the only thing that could prove his innocence and set him free from the accusations that he killed his wife. Chapter 30. Gary was making his way back from the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Gateshead, trying to get back as quickly as he could. Augustine and Ash were headed into danger, and he wanted to be by their side. Gary's sense of loyalty was sketchy at best. There were times when he just couldn't be bothered with the tasks he had been given. Those days he would wander off, trying to stay as far under the radar as possible. But when the chips were down, he wanted to be there. Some of it was to try to save disaster, but there was always still an underlying negativity in Gary's psyche. If Augustine was going to fail, then Gary wanted to be there to see it. Those competing ideals came together to motivate Gary to get an Uber and make his way back to Solgrave. Chapter 31. The two Marcus Brights sat opposite each other. One was waiting to feel the hard knife reach his flesh. The other was waiting for lips to loosen. The tension was strong, the pair of them definitely having the same will and determination. Maybe it was genetic, the Marcus Bright who was tied up thought. As the coldness of the knife touched flesh, Marcus flinched. The shock of the cold always made him jump. He immediately thought back to Ellie getting into bed with cold hands and using his torso to warm herself up. "Can't you wash your hands with hot water?" he used to say to her. "I have, but they're still cold. Warm them up for me," she replied every time. The cold was soon replaced with a much warmer sensation. The skin felt like it was being torn like a crisp packet. Marcus imagined a serrated hole in his side, exposing some of his innards. The reality was that the hole was clean and shallow. It only made it around 1/8 of an inch into his skin. But that was far enough for a few drops of blood to make their way along the breadth of the knife and trickle onto the floor. He could hear the sound of dripping. Again, Marcus's imagination went into overdrive, picturing a puddle of blood forming around his feet. He needed to get away from this, or the fear would be worse than the pain itself. Internally, he began a monologue that would keep him from staying in the room, instead going to a happier place where his life was whole again, and the man who was sat with him didn't exist. "My name is Marcus Bright. I was born to two happy and generous people who raised me to have the values of decency and respect. I was an only child at the time, and still am. They had all the love in the world, but chose to give all of that love to me. As I grew up, these people became more loving and caring each and every day. I grew from there into a valuable member of society. I love my hometown of Washington, where I lived with my wife Ellie and our beautiful children." At that point, Marcus's thoughts went to his kids again. He thought about them a lot over the previous few days, wanting to hold them and tell them everything was going to be all right. Marcus stayed deep in his thoughts, away from the wickedness that was being enacted on his body in the real world. Every now and again, the pain deepened, and he had to strengthen his resolve to keep the agony at bay. He knew that the man would have sent him something that would give him a glimmer of hope. In his days as a financial advisor, Marcus had to look at the way people's attitude to life shaped their decision-making when choosing investments or pensions. He had been trained over a number of years to spot the difference between someone who made rash decisions and then changed their mind over people who knew their mind. But Marcus felt like he'd always had this intuition. At school, he could tell the kids who wanted to fight but backed down, and those who would keep on going. And dealing with the flurry of packages from this man who claimed to be his identical twin brother gave Marcus all the clues he needed that the man was irrational and erratic. In that pile of boxes, he knew that the man would have delivered something in a fit of temper. It would be his undoing. In the box, Marcus Bright held a copy of the birth certificate that confirmed he had an identical twin. Marcus would hold on as long as he could. His innocence depended on it. He heard a voice in the room. As he resurfaced, he heard the voice say over and over again, "The problem is, I need you alive." Chapter 32. Augustine walked back through the maze of houses and streets that was Solgrave. He tried to picture the exact steps the pair of them had taken the previous day. He could see images in his mind of particular cars, bushes in gardens, and markings on curbs. As he retraced the steps, he could see the images in real life, ticking them off against a checklist in his mind. Ash just followed. He would follow the man into battle wherever it was, knowing that Augustine Boyle would get to the truth in the end. One car was parked on the opposite side of the street to the one he'd seen it on the day before. Augustine stopped for a few seconds, processing the fact that things were different to how they had been. Then he moved on. Ash was a step or two behind, watching left and right as Augustine moved slowly, methodically, towards the target he had in his mind. Ash loved working in the team, but he felt out of place at times. The rest of them could approach life in such a methodical manner. Alice and Electra were just like Gus, moving pieces of data out of their way until they ended up with the answer. Ash could barely use a spreadsheet, let alone extract the information he needed from one. Augustine was looking for one image in his mind to be replayed. He saw it as clear as day, but couldn't picture the exact location. It was a speaker sat on the top of a set of concrete stairs, leading to a flat. The wires from the speaker dangled down towards the ground, not quite reaching before making their way back into a garage. In front of that garage stood a Mitsubishi Colt, black and beaten. When he found that, Augustine knew that he had found his man. Chapter 33. Gary made it to the edge of Solgrave and told the Uber driver to drop him off there. The guy was talking about how Sky TV was dead, or some such phrase. Gary's leg hurt more listening to the man than it had ever done being cleaned and dressed in the hospital. He needed to go back 3 days later to have the dressing changed. Gary reminded himself not to call another Uber. He'd ask Agnes for a lift. He looked along the road where his colleagues had chased the man. It was damp underfoot. Gary didn't want to slip, so he took his time. As much as he wanted to be there as soon as possible, he had to be there in one piece. Gary looked at his phone for the first time since a minute before his Uber turned up at the hospital. No calls or texts from Augustine or Ash. He tried calling both as he walked. Nothing. Straight to answer phone. Must have their phones switched off. Reaching Augustine's car, parked at the same address as the day previous, Gary stopped and leaned on the bonnet to regain his breath. His fitness levels weren't where they should be, and the injury was causing him to walk at a funny angle to keep his trouser leg from rubbing at the dressing, which was causing an irritation. As he walked along the street, mirroring the direction he saw Augustine and Ash walk back from the day before, he spotted a couple of figures in the distance. Thinking they might be Augustine and Ash, he set off again, drawing deep breaths to see if he could bring oxygen into his aching leg muscles and catch up. Chapter 34. Augustine saw the Mitsubishi Colt as soon as they turned the corner. He made eye contact with Ash and then nodded his head over to the vehicle. "There," was the only word he said before walking off in the direction of the car, checking it out. The passenger side door wasn't locked, so Augustine opened and then proceeded to open the glove compartment too. The logbook confirmed what he had thought all along. It was registered in the name of Marcus Bright, at the address above his head. "Ash, this is the place. I'm sure of it." Augustine walked up the stairs carefully, straining his ears to listen at the door as he got to within a few steps of the summit. There were muffled screams coming from inside. Ash heard them too, and his shoulder made contact with the flimsy door, splintering the frame and sending the two detectives into the property. The darkness was intense, blackout curtains shielding light from every possible angle except from the freshly destroyed front door. Ash went into a room on the left, Augustine to the one on the right. Augustine drew a blank before hearing a thud coming from the other room. He dashed across the hall to see Ash lying across the doorway with both of his hands to his head. Augustine jumped over his colleague and received a similar blow to the head. Staggering back, he grabbed the frame of the door to steady himself. The darkness was taking over his senses. Augustine thought he could see movement everywhere, flicking his eyes backwards and forwards from side to side. He stopped, controlled his breathing, and listened. Another breath in the room was evident, so Augustine jumped at it, tackling the owner of the breath to the ground. He felt a slashing across his chest, pulling his right arm across to protect himself and dull the pain. Augustine swung his left fist in the direction he was facing, connecting with something soft. A groan came back at him. Augustine repeated the action, flinging his left arm, fist clenched, as many times as he could before he ran out of puff. It connected 7 times, the last being followed by a bang as the person he was punching hit the ground. The pain in his chest was now stifling any further movement. The lights turned on. Gary surveyed the room in front of him. Augustine was laid in the fetal position, holding both his arms across his chest, rocking from side to side. Right under Gary's feet was Ash, rubbing his head and blinking furiously. Marcus Bright, the man that they had been trying to locate and question over the murder of his wife, was tied to a chair, with blood seeping from a wound on the side of his torso. And then, the man who looked remarkably like Marcus, but with a long shaggy beard, was laid on the floor between Marcus and Augustine. Gary called for an ambulance as he started to work his way around the room. He untied Marcus Bright. All the while, Marcus repeated the same sentences over and over to Gary. "He's my identical twin I didn't know I had. He killed Ellie. It's his DNA all over the crime scene. I have her birth certificate in that box." Gary used the chair to secure the bearded man with handcuffs and popped his head outside to see if the ambulances were there. When he saw the flashing lights of 4 ambulances, Gary relaxed. He knew that the people in this small room would all get the medical attention they needed. The chase was over. Chapter 35. Marcus Bright's sister-in-law and his children arrived at his hospital bed as soon as the nurse allowed. He'd been in the operating theatre for several hours, getting his wound tended to and having his internal organs checked while he was there. The kids both broke into tears as he came round, barely opening his eye before closing it again as a teardrop escaped and ran down his cheek. "Dad, is everything going to be okay?" they asked in unison. "Let your father rest, kids, but once he's back on his feet, he'll do everything in his power to make sure you guys have the very best in life." For Marcus, this support from a sister-in-law who hadn't been his biggest fan over the years meant the world. Those words rung in his head as he sat up for the first time after the operation, trying to will his body to be out of hospital
and back home with his children. That was where Marcus Bright belonged. That was where he would make their life again. Who Killed Ellie Bright? Written by S. Thomas Thompson. Narrated by Christian Neal. The end.